A man plays a game. With him I play the same.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Goodrum Show with me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, a big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show, liked, commented, all that kind of stuff. Yep, very, very much appreciated. Talking of comments, there's been some really nice comments this week. Not that I don't get nice comments, but it just seems to have been a sort of a week of really nice comments. I mean, one viewer said about the Waterford one that it's the best review that he's seen online. Which is really flattering, and a couple of others, Annadale for example, Nickneen, have said nice things about the show, and I've had other comments about how how much sort of preparation and sort of what have you I go into, and yeah, that's really nice. It's always nice to have really nice feedback. And yeah, I try and make the episodes as entertaining as possible, balanced, which is always my favourite word. A bit of toasting, a bit of waffle. Sometimes the waffle goes on a little bit, yes, I know, and I do try and keep it as within the sort of like 30 minutes as much as possible. But obviously sometimes there's quite a lot of information that I think sort of like you guys, the viewers, would find informative. So I always like to sort of do my research so that I know what I'm talking about. That's always a good thing, isn't it? I suppose. Right, okay, so on to this week's episode of the show. Time for another independent bottling episode of the show, I think. I don't really need to sort of say an awful lot about Morrison Distillers and their Carn Mor range. I've done countless episodes of the show on their bottlings, but I just thought it would be nice to sort of take a look at some of their recent releases. So 5 of these come from their September release, and because I like to do 6, I thought, well, I'll just shoehorn in an old one. Well, relatively, from May, I think the Glentauchers was. But yeah, I seem to have an inordinate number of Carn Mor samples dotted around in boxes and what have you. So never short of some of their samples to do an episode of the show. And a big thank you to Morrison Distillers for the samples and the continued support. It's very, very much appreciated. So, not a great deal to waffle about today, you'll be pleased to know, and I'm just going to crack on with the lineup.
It makes me crazy.
Right, okay, so the first bottling we'll be looking at is a 10-year-old Linkwood, which had spent most of its 10 years in American oak before 18 months being finished in ex-Calvados French oak barriques. All samples have been bottled this year, and obviously bottled at their usual, or their now usual, AB of 47.5. Bottling number 2 is a 14-year-old Mortlach distilled in 2008. This was finished in a 225 litre or 225 litres ex-Muscatel French oak barriques. So as you know, the Strictly Limited range is a vatted range. They used to say how many casks that they used in the vattings, but no longer do so. But 2 to 3, I imagine. Number 3 is a 9-year-old Glenallachie, fully matured in Oloroso hogsheads, bottled at 47.5, distilled in 2015. Ooh, young and sherried. Anyway, I will not pass judgment until we actually get there. And more sherry. Oh joy. Yeah, you can see what episode this is going to be, can't you? This is a 11-year-old Glenburgie, again 47.5, first fill Oloroso hoggies. Yep, certainly looks like it, and distilled in 2015, but obviously bottled this year. More sherry. Woohoo! God, I am really going to enjoy this one. No, well, So this is a 9-year-old Glen Keith, distilled in 2013, wholly matured in Pedro Ximenez hogsheads. Oh, bloody hell. So we're not doing an overload of alcohol, we're doing an overload of sherry today. That's just the thing, I do sort of so many episodes of the show, obviously on American oak bottled releases, and then go for it every now and again with a sherry monster. Well, I wouldn't say sherry monster because obviously I'm kind of getting a little bit ahead of myself there. But anyway, last bottling is the May bottling. So this is a 10-year-old Glentauchers, and that has indeed been aged wholly in Pedro Ximenez butts as well. Look at the colour of these two. So 10 years old, distilled in 2011 and bottled this year. So, well, I think this is going to be quite interesting. Going to probably entertain you guys now, I imagine. So anyway, let's kick off with a bit of Linkwood then, shall we? Right, okay, so 10-year-old Linkwood finished in ex-Calvados cask. Let's see what the note gives us on this end. Okay, that's a nice nose. Fresh, citric, barleyed, white fruit, little bit of apple. Not an overload of the cask. It's got some quite chunky vanilla underneath that, so I would imagine possibly originally first fill American oak. Toasted toffee. Yeah, the American oak is becoming slightly more dominant as time progresses, but if you give it a bit more aeration, you then get more of the citrus and the sort of appley notes. But yeah, that's a nice nose. I like that. It's not too appley, it's not too overdone, and the balance is just about there. I mean, I like the citric notes that kind of keep the vanillins and the sort of chunky oak kind of in contained. So yeah, like this. So pass on. Again, fresh, citric, honeyed. Oak comes in relatively quickly. Vanilla, maybe not quite so chunky. There's that lovely citric note is kind of keeping the balance, and certainly being bottled at 47.5 is certainly emphasising the citrus. The Calvados is very subtle again. It kind of comes in on the end with that sort of appley note, and to be honest with you, if you didn't know that was finished in an ex-Calvados cask, you probably wouldn't pick it out, because the appley sort of notes do feel really quite well integrated. It's nice, it's fresh, it's not a heavy Linkwood, it's a more sort of fresh spay kind of Linkwood style. I really like that, and yeah, so that's a really good one to start with, I think.
My mind's invents are sinful.
Right, okay, so let's move on to the second bottling. This is the 14-year-old Mortlach, finished in ex-Moscatel cask. Let's see what those gives us on this end, shall we? Okay, so it opens up with the Moscatel notes, that grapey, slightly honeyed, winey note. A little bit of white fruit, some minerals, citrus. The sort of, I would say that the Moscatel is a little bit heavier, certainly heavier than the influence of the Calvados on the previous bottling. But I think it's just about balanced again. It's got some nice herbal spice, sort of. I wouldn't quite go as far as saying green spice, not quite cardamom and that kind of thing. A little bit of pepper maybe. Touch of honey, but it just seems to retain a nice kind of minerality, which is again, I guess, emphasised by the alcohol, and so it's not OTT at all. So pass on. again, beautifully balanced. The Muscatel cask notes really kind of come through on the mid palate, but it's also beautifully integrated, and it has that sort of lovely honeyed, slightly winey, white fruit, apricot, bit of dusty barley, bit of minerals, bit of American oak, bit of barley. I mean, that is just a lovely whiskey. And again, you know, this is the big key, I think, with using finishing casks, is to keep the finish subtle, to augment, to sort of make it feel like it's all completely natural. And this is just all really nicely contained. Again, it's another one of those sort of whiskies that, unless you knew it was finished in ex-Muscatel casks, you'd probably think it was as it was, you know, because it's so well integrated, and that honeyed note, it has a slight wininess, but it just works in really, really nicely. So again, another very, very good bottling, I think. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Glenallachie. So, 9 years old. In actual fact, I think, I'm pretty certain this is actually the first bottling of Glenallachie that Carn Mor, or that Morrison Distillers have actually done. I mean, I keep a fairly big database, obviously, of all my tasting notes, and I was updating it yesterday. I'm pretty certain this is, or certainly this is the first one that I've ever tasted. Anyway, I mean, they may well have released one, but that I hadn't tasted. But anyway, just an aside there. That's a bit raw, balsamic, herbal, coffeed, malty, a bit hard, a bit sherried. It's Glenallachie, really. At the end of the day, it's kind of, Glenallachie isn't a soft and sort of you know, caressing kind of spirit. It's kind of a bit of a grabbier kind of rough and ready kind of spirit. I mean, it works. I mean, Glenallachie has that character that works with sherry, you know. I've tasted numerous bottlings of Glenallachie, and you know, it's pleasant. I mean, it's okay. I mean, it's a little bit balsamic-y, possibly. It's not sort of a whiskey that I'm going to get really, really excited about, unlike the last couple. But it's clean. It's pleasant. It's young and kind of sherry. I mean, it sort of has distillery character, I guess. Or certainly I can pick it up anyway. So. Okay, let's see what passes on. The palate is not quite as raw as the nose kind of lets on. It's a little bit softer, a little bit sweeter. There's raisin-ated dried fruits, medium kind of length, little herbal kind of accent on the finish. Touch of toffee, maybe a little bit of coffee, a little bit of possibly tobacco leaf as well. It's all okay. It's, like I said, it's not a kind of whiskey that I would taste and get really enthusiastic about. And you know, there are sherry whiskies, obviously, as you well know, that I've been enthusiastic about. This, however, is not one of those. I mean, it's perfectly well made. It's okay. It does what it says on the tin. You get a bit of Glenallachie character, but you know, it is what it is at the end of the day. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Glenallachie. So, 11 years old, first fill Oloroso Hoggies. Let's see what that gives us. Oloroso, sherry, slightly industrial. I mean, Glenburgie is kind of like one of those sort of, it's really hit and miss. I mean, you know, this isn't sort of unpleasant again, but it is kind of verging on the slight industrial character. Even the sherry notes don't seem to have a particular depth and breadth to them, shall we say. It's kind of not really cool. It's sort of homogeneous sherry at the end of the day. I mean, I have to be said, it is quite unexciting. I must admit, I think I would slightly prefer the Glenallachie to this. At least the Glenallachie showed a little bit more character. This really could be any whiskey really. And like I said, even the sort of the sherry is kind of a bit, you know. Anyway, let's see what that's like. Again, the palate just pretty much mirrors the nose. It's kind of sherry by numbers. It's, yeah, a bit of dried fruit, a bit of citrus peel, a little bit of tannin possibly. It's a little bit medium length, I guess, and I'm probably being a little bit generous on that. It's not really that exciting at the end of the day, it has to be said. There's absolutely no distillery character whatsoever. It could be any old spey. And like I said, the sherry doesn't seem to have a great deal of depth of character either. It's all a bit kind of like, you know. So it does make me wonder why this was actually bottled. But this is the thing, you know. This is why I always say to, whenever I get a new independent or whatever, sort of like say, do you want to stock our whiskey? I always say, well, yep. You know, obviously any comments that I make about today's episode of the show, which I've already made, are obviously my own and have no bearing or relevance to the company that employs me. Forgot about that one for a minute. But, you know, if I had my buying hat on for, you know, whatever reason, like I said, you know, I always say to the independents, you know, I'm not going to take your word for your whiskey. You know, it could be good. You know, and you know, I'm not saying that either of those, you know, or certainly not these two were bad whiskey, but they were just not particularly exciting, you know. And it's sort of like, well, I'm not going to bother to try and sell a whiskey that doesn't excite me, that I don't think, you know, that you guys would want to drink, you know. And so it's a case of, well, no, I'm not going to buy blind. I'm always going to want to see a sample, and then I will make a decision based on that. And if I get behind it, I will get behind it. If not, I won't. Simple, really, isn't it? Okay, so let's move on to the 9-year-old Glen Keith PX Hoggies. Let's see what nose gives us on this end, shall we? Oh yes, that's PX. Grapey, treacly, sort of dark, raisinated fruit. Well, it's even beyond raisinated fruit. I mean, that's a good tasting note, isn't it? Yeah, it's dark and beyond raisinated fruit. I'm sure somebody could use that. Distillery character? No. Absolutely none whatsoever. It's a little bit of chocolate, a little bit of spice, there's a sort of a little bit of an edge there, I guess. Again, you know, it's if you like these kind of sherried monsters, then fine. But, you know, they don't really do anything for me at the end of the day. I suppose, I guess, you know, if I'm going to drink a sherried whiskey, and sometimes, you know, you think, well, if I'm going to have one, I may as well go completely over to the dark side. But, you know, most of the time it's sort of like, they're not a whiskey that I would, yeah, want to go for, to be fair, because, like I said, it's just a PX sherry at the end of the day. And if I wanted a PX sherry, I'd probably get a bottle of PX sherry, I suppose. Anyway, let's see what that's like. Treacle, prunes, a little bit of toastiness, bit of citrus, bit of alcohol, a little hot on the finish, but that treacle is still kind of underpinning all of that. Again, like on the nose, it's not particularly exciting. It's a sort of, it's PX sherry at the end of the day, with some alcohol, and it, you know, it just fine, you know. If that's your bag, then great. For me, yeah, it just doesn't have enough complexity. Right, and finally on to the Glentauchers 10-year-old PX Hoggies. Oh no, PX Sherry, but sorry, this isn't a Hoggy. Maybe, you know, Now that's a little bit more of an interesting nose, and kind of crossed my mind that it's maybe because the Hoggy is smaller, more intense, more wood to surface area, quicker integration of the sherry character, bigger barrel. Obviously the butt is a lot larger, slower integration. I actually quite like this. I think it's got a lusciousness. Again, dried fruit, prune, plum, raisin, a little bit of dusty spice, and it's got that Glentauchers kind of minerality. And now I know Glentauchers is a Speyside whisky, but it always reminds me of a Highland, and it has that characteristic, that real intense minerality that allows it to stand up to all sorts of casks and hammering, shall we say. And yeah, you know what, I kind of quite like this. You know, if I was going to go to the dark side, I would much prefer this to the previous bottling, because the previous bottling is just yeah, sherry. This has just got a little bit more going on, and a little bit of cocoa powder. I quite like this in a kind of, you know, a dirty secret kind of way, you know what I mean. Super fast one. Again, the palate is quite luscious, juicy, raisinated fruit, coffee, sticky toffee pudding. Again, sort of raisins. Again, minerality. It has the Glentauchers character. I can feel it kind of coming through. Obviously, it's emphasised by the ABV. There's a little bit of citrus, a little bit of chocolate on the finish. I quite like that. I mean, it's just got more character at the end of the day. I mean, yes, it is very much dominated by the sherry, but there's other things going on, and that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a little bit more of complexity, and it's a lot of it comes down to the distillery at the end of the day. You know, it's like certain distilleries like Glentauchers produce a spirit that kind of really works, and with sherry and other casks, and you could argue to a certain extent the Glenallachie style kind of does as well. It needs something to soften that bloody slightly industrial character. Just insult the distillery there. But you kind of get what I'm at. You know, if you have a distillery that has a style that works well with sherry, like those two, then brilliant. But then when you sort of use things like, you know, Glenkeith and sort of you know, other sort of you know, distilleries of that kind of ilk, you know, you just sort of like swamp their character because they just don't have the sort of the cojones to kind of deal with sherry, you know. Yeah, so I think that one worked really quite nicely, and I was, you know, quite happy with that. I mean, most of these kind of fall in these sort of mid-50s, I suppose, price wise, and probably a fair few you're going to go, oh, that's a bit pricey. But that's the current age we live in, you know, sort of to get an independent sort of bottling of this kind of ilk, and it is, you know, finding it less than 50 quid is a bloody miracle, to be honest with you. But you know, that I really like. So I mean, you know, as a retailer, stick one's retailer's hat back on again. You know, you need a variety. You know, even though there might not be the sort of whiskies that necessarily appeal to me, I still see interest in them. And you know, if somebody wants a sherry monster, then you know, that's not a bad sherry monster to have, in my personal opinion. So yeah, there you go, finishing on a sort of high note. Right, okay, so let's on today's episode of the show. So big thank you to Morrison Distillers for the samples for today's episode of the show. hopefully, everybody thinks that this is a balanced appraisal, and certainly I think there were some high points. Certainly the Linkwood, it finished in Calvados, was a lovely whiskey, beautifully balanced in my personal opinion. And like I said when I was tasting it, it didn't, unless you knew it was a Calvados finish, it didn't kind of whack you in the face with a Calvados character. And the same could be said to a certain extent to the Mortlach. Didn't kind of like overkill you with Muscatel. Again, really nicely balanced, harmonious, integrated, just the sort of thing that I was looking for. The Glenallachie, yeah, okay, not the most exciting whiskey on the face of the planet, but at least I could get a semblance of distillery character. There was a little bit more going on there, but at the end of the day, not one that I would get really excited about. The Glenburgie, I can say the same thing about the Glenburgie as I can say about the Glenkeith. It was all sherry and no trousers really at the end of the day, and that to me was just sort of like completely and utterly unexciting, I suppose. But then we had the Glentauchers, and the Glentauchers just showed, to me, what is a good sort of distillery to play around with sherry. It's got the sort of the character to sort of stand up to it. It certainly kind of comes through. It balances. Maybe it's like I said, it's because it was matured in butts rather than hoggies. It wasn't quite so intense on the sherry, and it just allowed maybe a little bit more of the distillery character to come through. Yeah, I mean, this is it. This is all a sort of a number of factors at the end of the day, certainly when you're playing around with these different casks. But anyway, food for thought, I suppose. So I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of the show. Probably a bit shorter than last week's, but less waffling. Anyway, so until next week, all that's left to say really is good afternoon and good dramming.